So, very good. So, the natural future of cosmetics team are delighted to welcome our guest speaker for today's cosmetic formulation event, Dr. Brian O'Rourke. Dr. O'Rourke is a formulation expert with almost 30 years of cosmetic and pharmaceutical industrial experience. So altogether, he's worked with 15 companies, focusing mostly on new product development in areas as diverse as self-tanning, serum, hair care, skin care, and sunscreening products. So he became a full-time lecturer and researcher in the Institute of Technology, Carlow in 2000, and his research interests include pharmaceutical formulation and the use of microemulsions and other novel delivery systems as replacements for organic solvents in industrial processes. So he's been granted numerous European patents for his invented compositions and has also worked as a consultant to the cosmetic and pharmaceutical sectors, both in Ireland and in France. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand you over to Dr. O'Rourke to start today's formulation event.
Thank you, Niall. Good afternoon, everybody. I've worked, as Niall has said, in this business for a very long time, a lot more years than I'd care to remember. My first patent was in 1988, and for those of you who've got any experience of patenting, usually there's about 2 or 3 years of preparation and work and various things like that before they actually come to fruition. So I've been involved in this business for a long time. I would like to try during this presentation to convey to you that it's very important that even though we're talking about natural products here, that we have to make products which are good products in their own right. There is no point in making a product and then expecting that, you know, the public is going to buy it and they're going to accept second best because you say to them, oh, but by the way, did you know that my product contains naturals or is made with naturals? Really what we want to do here is we want to make products of very high quality. Now, in a way, we're constrained by that because there are now legal regulations which were not in force, certainly when I first got involved in this business many years ago. So just to preface my presentation by saying to you that what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make good cosmetic products which happen to be natural, which happen to come from natural sources. And there are certain compromises which we have to accept as a result of that, and we simply make them. So for example, some time back, I was asked to make a hair conditioning product for a lady who has a range of salons in the Midlands. And she said she wanted it to contain bamboo extracts. And I said, well, why do you want it to contain bamboo extracts? And she said, well, because people have this view of bamboo that it's tough and that it's got a shiny surface on the outside, and it will convey this impression that somehow it's going to do that to the hair shaft. Now, of course, the actual effect of bamboo extracts on the hair shaft is exactly the same as the extract of, extract of water. There is no scientific evidence to sustain the notion, that bamboo does anything in particular to the hair shaft. So, try and have clear in your minds the notion of what you can sell by way of a marketing spin, which is absolutely fine. We're not going to be po-faced here. We want to try and make good products. We want to sell good products. We want to have a marketing story, but, not to fool ourselves about what these things actually do. Now, oh, for some reason it's saying no to me. Let me just see. Oh, my apologies. Maybe it's this guy here. There we go. Okay. Now, how do we define a natural cosmetic? Well, there's a particular definition here, and I'm going to do some of the sort of, the wordy stuff first. And there are very good reasons why I do that. According to the Natural Products Association, it must contain minimum of 95% natural ingredients. In other words, there's an acceptance out there that we must have things which are functional. And there are certain functional things which you find it difficult to find in things which are strictly natural and strictly organic. So we have a little bit of leeway which allows us to, for example, include preservatives and various other things like that, which, can escape, for want of a better term, can come under the radar of 95%. And there's a realization that this is required in order to get the sort of quality of product that we're looking for. What do we mean by natural ingredients? Well, they come or are made from renewable resources. Now, curiously, you might think that something which comes from flora would be perfectly normal. Fauna, you probably think about maybe something like beeswax or something along those lines. But curiously, mineral is also included in that. So that if you consider, for example, zinc oxide, which is the principal ingredient in Sudocrem, you might be surprised to find that that's a perfectly acceptable ingredient by, in the Natural Products Association definition of natural ingredients. Now, of course, petroleum compounds are strictly forbidden according to this definition. And, synthetic non-natural ingredients can be used, but only if there's no readily available natural alternative ingredient. So this more or less sets out the framework in which we can make natural cosmetic products. Now, in the past, things were easy. I met a fellow some years back and he was working for Henkel, the giant chemicals manufacturer. And he was supplying shampoo raw materials to a fellow in the East End of London, or a number of people in the East End of London. And these people were making shampoo. They made shampoo in a bath. They stirred it around using a stick. They allowed it to run out the downpipe. They collected the downpipe contents and they filled it into bottles. And as he was saying, they made a tidy living out of it. They were doing okay, thanks very much. Now, of course, these would be regarded as unhygienic conditions. And in addition to that, there would be no stability undertaken. In other words, if you got the product and you went home with it and you found that there was some separation occurred, that if some precipitation of some solids occurred at the bottom of the bottle, if it changed color, all of these sort of things, and certainly there'd be no such thing as a shelf life. So this is the way things were in the past. In addition to that, there was the issue of possible contamination. Now, this is a much more serious issue because where you get bacteria and yeasts and molds contaminating a product, of course, they're going to grow. Now, if they are yeasts and molds, typically they are regarded as spoilage organisms. In other words, they will just mar the appearance of the product. If by contrast they are bacteria and they're pathogenic, then of course there's a lot of health implications, and we're going to be talking about this in just a few moments. In addition to that, there's the whole area of package interaction. In other words, will the product attack the package or vice versa? And, when you consider that you're going to be unscrewing the cap of the bottle and tightening it back on, is it going to be okay? Is the plastic going to be damaged? Is it going to shatter? And all of these sort of things we have to consider. And this has led to the development by the European Union of what we call the CPNP. And this is the Cosmetic Products Notification Portal. Now, I'm coming at this from the perspective, effectively, we're starting at the end, and you'll have to forgive me for this because it'll make sense when I present the other information as to why we're doing what we're doing and why we do it. And the reason is that we can sell nothing, we can make nothing unless we subscribe to the requirements of these various portals and various regulations. Now, this is not a terribly attractive picture because it's very difficult to open up this website without actually registering a particular product for it. I have done it myself in the past. And, so all I'm showing you here is the page that you would encounter when you first open up the CPNP. And it asks, of course, a lot of questions about Brexit and so on, and we'll be talking about all this stuff later on. But you must register your product on this portal. And you must indicate a number of pieces of information about it. And then you must also register with the Irish regulatory authority, the HPRA. And again, I'll talk about those in just a moment. But you can see there's a number of questions which must be completed or must be answered. And these are scientific questions. So the notion that somehow, you can, in your kitchen, make up a mixture and you can fill it into bottles and you can bring it down to your local market and you can sell it from a stall. Well, you might be able to get away with that for a certain period of time, but you can be inspected and product can be seized. And, there are real powers attaching to these regulations. This is the regulation in question. I can't see the whole thing because my screen is a bit compromised. It doesn't really matter. The reality is it's from 2009. And I want you to appreciate that there are two different aspects to this. The first one, as I've just said, is the Cosmetic Products Notification Portal, and that is run by the European Union. Whereas in Ireland, what we have is the Health Products Regulatory Authority, the HPRA. Now, the HPRA came into being, it used to be known as the Irish Medicines Board, and this came into being in regulating pharmaceutical activity. So the people who are involved in the HPRA tend to come from a pharmaceutical background. And of course, pharmaceutical manufacture and pharmaceutical distribution and all the various chains or steps in the chain of pharmaceutical distribution, these things are obviously very highly regulated, and they bring this high regulatory requirement to the cosmetic business. Sometimes they can be a little bit too zealous, and you begin to say to yourself, well, look, is it really that necessary? Do we really have to do all of that sort of stuff, you know, in order just to sell a cosmetic product? And usually there's a little bit of, you know, you don't have to go obviously as far as a pharmaceutical, but, you know, there are very definite stringent requirements on stability and on preservation in particular, and they will absolutely insist upon those. So let's have a look first of all at the CPNP and what is it looking for? It is looking for formulation details. Now, by formulation details, I do not mean your formulation. What do I mean by formulation? Effectively, I mean the ingredient listing and the amounts. Now, you do not have to say that. You do not have to be precise about the quantities involved. This is your intellectual property. You will see a little bit later on as to why it is that these are very important, that you keep them secret as much as you can. Particularly where it comes to the amount of preservative that you're using and irritation and various other things like that. And the CPNP does not insist that you tell them what percentages you have of particular ingredients. They just set ranges. So therefore, within this range, you can state how much material that you're using, but you're not going to say exactly how much, and there's no need for them to know. I want you to note that term INCI, this INKI, because we talk about the INCI name. I'll talk about that in just a few moments, but they will need the INCI name. And if you pick up any cosmetic product and you look at the ingredient listing, you will see a certain way that the terms are represented, and they are using the so-called INCI names. What else is required in the CPNP? Well, they want to know about particular toxins. If, for example, your product contains certain glycols, so that, for example, you know, propylene glycol would be used as an antifreeze. You will get various other ethoxylated solvents, and they will regulate these very severely. So the amount of these things which is to be found in your product, they need to know about, and they need to know in advance. And you must stipulate when you are registering with this portal exactly what the levels of these solvents are. In addition to that, they want to know where the product is targeted. If you've got something, for example, for the eye orbit, or if you have it for the axillae, in other words, under the arms, or just if it happens to be for use around the face or on the body, then there are particular regulations governing the different parts of the body. And obviously, if you've got mucous membranes, for example, around the lips and so on, then there are going to be requirements which are more stringent than those, for the sake of argument, for medications or for cosmetics which are being put on the feet, for want of a better term. Okay, what about the HPRA? What are they looking for? HPRA are looking for this to be completed. It's the PIF, the Product Information File. Now, this is where we get into the nuts and bolts technicalities, because up to this point, we have just registered our product and we've said, guess what? It doesn't contain any of these nasty solvents. And by the way, these are the various percentages of ingredients which are to be found in my product. And that is fairly hands-off, and there isn't a huge amount of work involved in it. But this, by contrast, is now looking for detailed information on the stability of the product. So how are we going to decide whether or not a product is stable? Do you just manufacture a batch of it and then go away for 2 or 3 years, and then you come back 2 or 3 years later on and you say, well, guess what? My product is stable. Well, it isn't quite that simple, as we'll see in just a few moments. But also they want to know about preservation. And in particular, they want to know about the preservative efficacy test. Now, if you make a batch of product of any description, food product, cosmetic product, and it is unpreserved. And imagine that you bring it home, and imagine that there's a child who's just been to the lavatory and hasn't washed his or her hands, and they put their hand into your product. Well, of course, their hands are going to contain small amounts of various pathogenic bacteria, and these bacteria are going to enter your product. And because of the fact that your product typically will contain fat and water and electrolyte, and it'll be kept at a reasonably constant temperature, these bacteria are going to proliferate. They're going to generate teeming millions or even billions, which means that the next time you use the product around your face or around your eyes or wherever it happens to be, then of course you're going to get a massive dose of these bacteria. So that in the normal course of events on your hands, you're going to have these bacteria anyway, but when they get into the product and they start to grow and proliferate, of course, you're going to have huge doses. So in order to prevent that from happening, we must include preservative. And this preservative must be fit for purpose, and we must show that it's fit for purpose. In addition to that, we must show the manufacturing formulation and the procedure for formulation. This is very much a technicality, because we've already said, what the formulation is. We have said how much in ranges of our different components there are. So we have no need to tell the HPRA exactly what the concentration of ingredients are. I have heard it said by some people that if you go straight to the HPRA website before going to the CPNP, then HPRA will expect you to say exactly how much of each ingredient is in the product. Now, I can't validate that for myself, but I would certainly say go to the European website first of all. It's relatively straightforward, it's relatively easy to use, and it'll start the registration process. Now, another thing which is very important is the cosmetic product safety report. And this has to do with toxicology and irritation and sensitization. Now, an awful lot of people get very scared when they see stuff like this and they say, my God, how much am I going to have to spend in getting this product tested for irritation and toxicology and all the rest of it. Now, you needn't worry about that in the vast majority of cases, because most, in fact, I would fairly well say all of the raw materials that you will be using have previously been tested and evaluated for safety. And all you're doing is you're combining these materials in a particular way, and you're not chemically altering them, so that the regulatory authorities are quite happy that you're using well-trusted materials, you're combining them in well-trusted and well-known formulation types, whether it be creams or emulsions or serums or lotions or whatever they happen to be. And essentially all you do is you pass on the toxicological information that you have for your product. There was a major kerfuffle about 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, where the Body Shop were then, a very important company, and they wanted to put on their package that the product had not been tested on animals. And they tried to sell the product in Germany on that basis. And the German courts threw it out because they said that each of the ingredients that you're using in your products by law at that time had to be tested on animals. So therefore, despite the fact that your product hasn't been tested on animals, you know full well that the raw materials have, and therefore we are not allowing you to make a claim that this has not been tested on animals. Now, even though they got away with those claims in the UK and in Ireland and whatever else. So another thing which arises here is the difference between irritation and sensitization. Now, by irritation, I mean that for the sake of argument, you stick your hand into a vat of acid and you get a burn. Well, you wouldn't run to your nearest and dearest and say, my God, I put my hand into a vat of acid and I got a burn. I must be allergic to acid. Of course you wouldn't say that, because we know that acid causes severe burns and irritation, and it really doesn't matter who you are or anything about it. So therefore, this is a straightforward irritation reaction. Oops, my lights have just gone. I hope you can still see me. Sensitization is a different matter, and here we're talking about the allergic response. So there are certain people, for example, those who respond to nickel jewelry and the like, and they are going to respond in a particular way, and they're going to become sensitized to particular materials. All I will say to you is, when it comes to registering a product, there will be certain products, or certain raw materials rather, which will have a tendency to sensitization. That tendency will be well known, it'll be well signaled in advance, And therefore, you know, effectively you would either decide, look, I'm going to take a chance on this, or I'm going to avoid it, or whatever it is you decide to do. Okay, let's talk about a preservative efficacy test. Look at this, isn't this just beautiful? This is called Staph aureus or Staphylococcus aureus. Now you can see why it's called aureus, can't you? It's this beautiful golden color. Now, of course, it's beautiful and golden, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's particularly good for you, because this is a pathogenic bacterium. And it has all sorts of problems associated with skin and blood infections and various other things like that, which do not make it particularly agreeable. So these are the sort of things we are trying to kill when we put our preservative into our product. So we formulate our product and then we include preservatives. And the only function of those preservatives is to try and ensure that things like this do not grow. We know, of course, about E. coli, and that, of course, causes gastroenteritis and, you know, various digestive, very serious complaints. So these are the sort of things we are trying to kill. But in addition to that, we have these spoilage organisms. Now, typically Candida, and this guy here would be the commonest that we're trying to target. This thing here is another handsome looking beast, but he's really annoying as well, because this fellow is called Aspergillus niger. Now you can see why he's called Niger, of course, because he is black. But this fellow is more commonly known as mildew. So for those of you who've got damp houses and you see black patches growing, then this is the guy that's responsible for it. You typically will get it only growing in aqueous product, of course, but sometimes you get it in, you know, oily products, even in Vaseline, where in the air pocket above the product, you can get moisture trapped and, you know, it can grow like a spidery-like filament in the area just above the cap. But, you know, in general, as a general rule, you can say that, you know, oily products tend not to be contaminated either with bacteria or indeed with molds. As a general rule, you can say that. Okay, we spoke about stability before. And we said, are we going to hang around for 2 or 3 years waiting for our product to start changing? And of course, we don't do that. What do we actually do? Well, what we do is we concertina time into a short space. How do you do that? Well, you take samples and you store them at high temperatures. And what we're hoping to do here is we're hoping to speed up processes which would normally take place over a long period of time. And by warming up the process, we can get them to happen in a much quicker time. It's a bit like you put food into your fridge, and of course, it's going to degrade much more slowly than if you put it out on a warm summer's day. I mean, that's a perfectly straightforward analogy. So similarly here, if you can take a product and you can put it at 40 degrees, and you can keep samples then in daylight, you can have samples out of the light to see whether or not there's a difference between the two of these. And then you keep samples at 4 degrees. And the purpose of 4 degrees is just comparator. So in other words, you put your samples on at 40 degrees for 12 weeks. And then after 2 weeks, you take them out and you compare them with your sample in the dark in the fridge at 4 degrees. And you always assume that the 4 degrees one is unchanging, because it's very difficult for you to remember exactly what the batch looked like when you first made it. So, you know, you start off making a batch and then you put samples, usually in glass bottles. I'll talk about the detail in just a moment. At 40 degrees, you put them at room temperature daylight, room temperature dark. Now, of course, you'll immediately say, but daylight, surely that depends on the time of the year. You know, you get intense sunshine and daylight during the summer months and you don't get it at all during the winter months, and that's absolutely true. Typically, when we do daylight determination, we have it on a north-facing window because we want to get the effect of light. We don't want a heating effect, because if we get a heating effect combined with light, then we're going to get a complex behavior, and what we want is simplicity if we possibly can. We take a glass vial and we take our chosen package. Why do we do that? The reason is that if I give you a product and I say, fill this into your chosen plastic jar for the sake of argument, and you come back after 3 or 4 weeks and you say, well, look, I had it at 40 degrees and look, it's all degraded. And the problem then is knowing whether or not something in the jar has leaked into your product or leached into it and has caused your product to become unstable. Whereas if you have it in glass, nothing is going to leach into it. And you can say for definite, it is because your product itself is unstable. So that effectively what we do when we're doing these stability evaluations is we do samples in glass and we do samples in a series of different packages. And when we do them in a series of different packages, well, of course, we can see that, you know, it works better in a polyethylene or in a polypropylene or in a cardboard or whatever it happens to be. But we can also tell that the product of itself is stable. The way in which we fill these vials is we typically fill them 2/3 full. The reason why we do that is when we put the stopper on it, we don't need to take the stopper off in order to see the surface of the product, and we can see if there's any oil slick developing on it, or if there's any bacterial colonies growing on the surface, etc. So we typically would do it in a vial 2/3 fill. What are we looking to see? Well, the obvious thing is visual. When we look at our product, has it changed in color? Is there any separation on the surface? When we take the cap off of it, are we getting an odor? If we start to get bad odors, it usually indicates that bacteria are growing, or maybe that our perfume just doesn't work anymore, assuming that we have a perfume. In addition to that, we look under the microscope, because under the microscope can give us a lot of information. It'll tell us things which are about to happen in our product, which we may not be able to see with the naked eye. So we can tell, for example, if there is any movement of the oil droplets in our emulsion, or if, you know, our gel is starting to form clumps or whatever it happens to be. It's often easier to see these things under the microscope than it is with the naked eye. pH is a nice, easy way of measuring things because what we're looking for here is boredom. I run practicals with my students here in IT Carlow, and I say to them, you know, when you're doing this stability evaluation, what we're really, really hoping for is the most boring thing you could possibly imagine. That is to say that you make it 3 months ago, it looks exactly the same 3 months later, it hasn't changed in pH, it hasn't changed in color, it's got exactly the same smell, all that sort of good stuff. That is what we're looking for. Now, of course, students will find that boring. Of course, if you're developing a product, you say, this is wonderful. This is exactly what we're looking for. Viscosity, of course, means thickness. So if you find that your cream, which was nice and thick, is now pouring out of the bottle relatively easily, it has lost body, it has lost consistency, this, of course, is a symptom of degradation. Now, these are some examples. I stole this sample on the left-hand side from one of my students this morning in the lab, and she was doing a stability evaluation of a cream, and appropriately enough, this cream has creamed. This is referred to as creaming, when you get a layer of fatty material sitting above a layer of aqueous material. You can see the vial has been filled about 2/3. There is no need really to be able to tell whether or not, you know, you can see the surface of this thing because there's no point. And there would be absolutely no point in doing microscopic evaluation of this because clearly the thing is unstable. This other, by contrast, is a sunscreening product. Now, this is not an organic product, but just to give you an indication of what can happen, I do not know whether you can make out that there's a color there. There's a layer on the top of this product, and this product was based on alcohol and silicone, and clearly the alcohol has evaporated off. Now, obviously, this thing is unstoppered, and it wasn't this particular bottle where the loss occurred. But the alcohol has been lost, and there has been a separation of some silicone from the main body of the sunscreen. So this is the sunscreen body here, which will contain all of the sunscreening actives and so on. So these are clear examples, clear visual examples of something which is unstable. As a general rule, when I used to work full-time in the cosmetic business, if ever we made a sample up, a new sample up, we would always keep it overnight at about 40 degrees. Now you're probably going to say to yourself, how in the name of God am I going to find 40 degrees at home or in my kitchen? Well, you know, if you get some of those hot packs that they use, you know, that sportsmen use and so on, and if you happen to have a polystyrene box, now you may or may not have such a thing, but by just tweaking with these and getting the temperature right, you can tweak the temperature inside in this box to be 40 degrees. It's not easy, but you can do it. Take my word for it. Anyway, we would always leave samples in the 40-degree incubator overnight if they were new products. And then when we came in the next day, we would have a look at them and we would see if any separation occurred, even during the night. And at that stage, we could say, look, this product has prospects, or else we would say the product hasn't. I'll be showing you visually in just a few moments a cream I made this morning, and I'll be showing what sort of things you need to watch out for when it comes to making a cream. Okay, microscopic. This is essentially what we're looking for. We're looking for something bland and banal. Doesn't it look wonderfully boring? Now, I know you can see, if you just look very carefully, you can see there are some of these droplets here, and they seem to have circles around them. They look like droplets. When you get a heavy margin like that around something, it almost always indicates it's an air bubble. And this one here is quite different. So this one here is some sort of a separation of an oil droplet. It looks perfectly okay. There are tiny droplets there. If this happened at the end of 12 weeks, you'd probably say, this product is probably going to be all right. If you found it after about a week, you'd say, no chance. Throw it out. We're going nowhere with this. This is never going to be a runner. Now, by contrast, I want you to look at these. Now, these came from an extraordinarily expensive cosmetic product, probably one of the most expensive cosmetic products you'll find in the market at the moment. And you can see on the left-hand side, we've got very definite crystal formation. And you can see on the right-hand side, we've got very definite clumping. Now, I know you're probably going to say, well, what's a few crystals between friends? For goodness sake, man, what's wrong with that? Look at the way they're beautifully dispersed. Isn't it a handsome product? Well, the problem is that crystals will do one of two things. They will either float or they will sink. And when they float or when they sink, you will get a deposit or you'll get a raft of crystal forming on the top of your product. If it happens to be a sunscreening type product, then you know full well that you're going to lose your sun care protection because you will have no sunscreening active dissolved in your product base. So these two products looked absolutely wonderful and they behaved beautifully on the skin. Now, I'm not sure how they managed to get through registration. They did. So, you know, let's not lose our, how shall I put it? Let's not call it cynical. Let's just be a little bit realistic. You know, we live in the real world here, and you know, with lots of marketing and lots of publicity, you can get away with a lot of stuff. Now, that, of course, is outside of your budget frame, I have no doubt. Let's talk about packaging compatibility. We've already said that we like to use glass because it's impervious to penetration. So when you put product into a glass vial, you effectively expect it to remain inert as regards packaging. The packaging will not attack it, and it will not attack the packaging. So therefore, it's a very good standard. So you can say that, you know, if your product stands up to the rigors of testing in a glass vial, and if it happens to fail in a plastic package or some other sort of a package, then you can say, look, the product is fine, but we have to do something about the package. What tends to happen, though, is because plastics have a plasticizer and it tends to leach out and you can get a damaged, brittle package. So have a look at this guy on the right-hand side. Again, I found this in one of the labs and we use vegetable oils for various things. I think you'll agree this has been knocking around a bit for, you know, it looks like somebody played football with it. They didn't, take my word for it. This is called paneling. Now, if I could, I'd show you the overhead view because it looks a bit like a diamond shape. It is no longer a square box section. These two ends have folded in, and this bit here is the long axis, for want of a better term. So in other words, it is collapsed in on itself. No pressure was put on it. It's just that the oil dissolved out the plasticizers in the plastic, and the plastic just took up that conformation. So this is a classic example of the sort of thing that can happen, not just with oils. If you happen to have an emulsion, the emulsion, of course, is going to contain oil. That oil is going to attack the plasticizer as well. Possibly, maybe not. Another example here is this guy, and this is called stress cracking. Now, you will get this anyway. If you happen even to have a bottle of water and you keep taking the cap off and tightening it back on and unscrewing it and tightening it back on, over a period of time, you'll get stress cracking appearing on the top. But the products that we're using will tend to accelerate that process because they will tend to weaken the plastic by taking out various ingredients in them. So these are things we need to watch out for. And this whole area is called compatibility. So we have the stability program by itself, which looks at the product or products, And then we have the compatibility, which is how well it gets on in the package that we are proposing for it. Occasionally what happens is that simply the product goes straight through the wall of the product and it'll take away a label, so that you may have made this beautiful label, and you'll find that labeling is a cheaper way of applying, your details to a product instead of, getting them printed on a bottle or whatever it happens to be. But you have to be careful that the product doesn't pass through the plastic walls of the product and weaken the adhesive and cause the labels to fall off. And I've heard about that on many occasions in the past. Okay, sensitization, irritation, how do we do it? How do we test it? Well, we know full well that we are using safe raw materials, or we should do, unless we particularly want to go and launch a new raw material which is unknown to the cosmetic market. We may extract something that hasn't been extracted before, in which case we're effectively into a different regulation as regards registration and so on. But we still like to sleep quietly in our beds, knowing that the product that we've put together is good quality and it's not irritating. And the way in which we get around that is by using things called fin chambers. And we can do these by testing ourselves, or friends or work colleagues or whatever they happen to be. And the problem is, of course, that because of the fact that we work in the business, we tend to become sensitized. In other words, when we're working with preservatives all the time, and I work with them, an awful lot of the time, it's possibly the case that I would respond differently to the man and woman in the street. Anyway, they are still very valuable and make a valuable contribution to, your peace of mind. This looks a wee bit like a dog's bowl. It's the way they have these dogs and cats bowls, and they have a ridge on the side of them. And you may or may not be able to see, but it's an aluminium based that. What do we do with the product? We take a piece of filter paper and we soak it with the product, and we put it inside in this wee dish. And then we apply it to the skin in an occluded fashion, by which I mean we do not allow any air present, and we trap the product right up close against the skin. And in doing so, we present the ideal conditions for irritation to occur if the irritation has any tendency to occur in the first place. Now, this is an example of my very own arm, and don't make any comments about how miserable and pale and everything it looks. Thanks very much. But you can see I've put a product on this, and I applied it for 24 hours, and it was a serum product, and you can see that, I would certainly rest easy in my bed. Now, it wasn't just myself, there were other people who did this test, but you can see that there is no irritation occurring here. If there were irritation, or indeed if I were sensitized to it, then that patch would go red. Now, there's an issue then about, okay, well, just how red is red? And you can use colorimeters they're called, and you can measure the intensity of the red response if you feel so inclined. Now, that's okay for people who are in, large multinationals, but for the rest of us, if we start seeing irritation, we immediately say, this is not right. I can't trust this out on the marketplace. So that, effectively, we just are looking for something like this, something which shows no response. So that's after 24 hours of occlusion. Occasionally what we do is, if we want to pick the right level of preservative and we want to try and include the maximum amount we can, we would often do maybe half a dozen of these things, and we'd have different levels of preservative in them, because preservatives, of course, are highly bioactive compounds, and they tend to cause irritation in a certain proportion of the population. So we like to try and see that we have, we're in a safe area where it comes to the amounts of these things. Now, hygienic manufacture. Well, hygiene is the most interesting thing. Many years ago, I was making a batch of product in Bombay, as it was then called, in India. And they had this notion that in the manufacturing area, I was making a batch of perfume. And I had to take off my shoes and my socks coming into the manufacturing area, if you don't mind. I hadn't done that before. And they were making the batch, and I suddenly noticed there was air coming in through a fan. And this was just one of these old rusty steel fans, which is put into the wall, excuse me, and it was drawing in the dirt and filthy air off the streets. So I wasn't really sure what the purpose of the exercise was, because obviously my shoes didn't cut it, and obviously my socks weren't up to much either. They weren't making any personal comments, you understand. but they were still drawing in this filthy air from the streets. So when it comes to hygiene, try and do joined up thinking as best you can, which isn't always necessarily easy. I presented something to you here, which is just a fragment under high magnification of a tablet. And this tablet was made in one of my teaching labs. Usually what I would have expected to find is tiny amounts of hair or bristle, something black anyway, and whether it be an eyelash or an eyebrow or something along those lines, etc. And the only thing I could get was this, with this tiny fragment of some sort of dust or dirt. I don't know where it came from. But I just want you to bear in mind that when it comes to manufacturing, that even though you might think your place is spotless, that you can get dirt and you can get, contamination in your product relatively easily. There is a very good reason for people wearing hairnets when it comes to the manufacture of food. And the other thing to say is, in general, where it comes to inspections by the HPRA, they love to see white tiled surfaces which have been freshly swabbed, because they will be happy then that products are being manufactured according to good manufacturing practices. And effectively what goes in food will go in cosmetic manufacture as well. But anyway, this just gives you an indication of how we get contamination occurring in things. And it's only when you're brought, up close and personal with it. And here it's trapped in a tablet. Whoops, sorry, I don't know how I did that. I think I pushed too hard. There we go. It's only when you see it like that trapped in a tablet. You would never see it in a liquid. You'd never see it in a cream or an emulsion. But it makes you realize that, we are living in dirty environments. Okay, earlier on I referred to INCI names. And why is there an INCI name? Well, if you think about it, there's a lot of things and we give them different names. Glycerol is the term that we chemists usually use when we're referring to glycerine. And of course, in this part of the world, we refer to glycerine with an E on the end, but whereas you go to America, of course, it's glycerin with no E on the end. So that when it comes to the registration of products, there's a certain, how shall I put it, stock number of names which we use interchangeably more or less across the world. And the particular word that we use for glycerine is glycerin, the American version. For some extraordinary reason, we refer to water as aqua. Okay, we're all going to be classical scholars. When it comes to sugar, we call it sucrose. Now, of course, those of you who are of suspicious temperament will probably say, yeah, that's a good way of hiding sugar in an ingredient listing. You just call it sucrose and nobody knows what you're talking about. But, as I say, this is the INCI name. Perfume, we get all very French and we call it parfum. When it comes to shea butter, for example, we use the Latin name, which is Butyrosphaermum parkii, which I assume is the name of the tree from which the shea butter gives its nuts. And for something as straightforward as aloe vera, we call it aloe barbadensis. Now, these are all very commonly available terms. All you need to do is Google them and you can put them all together. Okay, let's have a look at a typical emulsion and what you might find. I'm just going to talk a little bit. I'm going to get technical very, very briefly, just to explain to you what emulsions and emulsifiers are all about, because they are probably the most problematic of products that you can make yourselves. And, when it comes to the cosmetic market, of course, by far and away, the most important element of that would be cosmetic creams. So this is a product I made, I don't know how long ago it was. This is not the image which I got under the microscope. I've pinched this from some other source, I don't know where. What I want you to appreciate is we've got under the microscope is we've got all of these small oily droplets. Now, you look at these and you say, yeah, okay, oily droplets, well, yeah, all right, what's the problem? What's the issue here? Well, the problem is that it's not natural for that to happen. Because if you consider, for example, a salad dressing and you go into your favorite restaurant and you order a plate full of salad or lettuce or whatever, oh, the lights are back on, or whatever it happens to be, and you get your French dressing and you shake it up. Well, of course, you shake it, and you get all of these oil droplets and they're floating around in the vinegar, and then you leave it to settle. And of course, it goes back to the original situation where the oil is floating on the top. And then you say, well, guess what? I'd stick an old blender into it. And you give it a zap with a blender. And you think to yourself, oh, when it breaks up into tiny droplets, it's going to be more stable. It's going to stay like that. And then I can shake it on the salad all night and I needn't worry about shaking it again, but of course that isn't true. But because the point is that even though you make all of these tiny droplets, the fact is you're generating surface area along here, and this surface area is hydrophobic. In other words, oil and water hate one another. And when you generate a big surface area here, all these tiny droplets, all in contact with the water, energy or nature prefers that this restore itself to a situation where there's very little contact between the oil and your vinegar. And this is a general principle of nature. In other words, emulsions should not be stable. Now, we find them everywhere in life. We find butter, we find milk, we find cream. There's an awful lot of things which are natural emulsions, and we take them for granted. And of course, we take them for granted in cosmetic products. But the reality is we are fighting against nature in making products which are stable. And in fact, they are never really stable. So all emulsions eventually will break down by virtue of the fact that we are fighting against nature. And the reason we're fighting against nature is because we have this hydrophobic interaction between oil and water. So what do we do to prevent this? Well, the answer is we use these things called emulsifiers. Now, I'm not going to bore you with science here. I just want to point out to you that if you consider that this little tadpole thing has got a dual nature, that it's got a part of it which just loves oil and a part of it which just loves water, but by the way, has a charge on it. And when you put this in on top of your dispersed oil droplets in your vinaigrette, or whatever it happens to be, your oil and water system, all of these oily tails bury themselves into the oil droplet. And when they do that, these charged things stick up onto the surface. And that now means that when a similar droplet comes into close proximity, its negative charges are going to meet these negative charges. What does negative do when it meets negative? Well, like repels like. So it's a bit like you get a magnet and you've got the two poles of the magnet, and north and south are going to attract one another and they're going to click together. But if you upend them and you put the two north poles together, they will repel. So effectively what we're doing with emulsifiers is we're trying to ensure that these droplets not meet. We put these things called emulsifiers into our system in order to ensure that we make sure that the droplets not meet. And one way in which we do it is by using a charge. I will not bore you with the details. The physics class is nearly over. There's one other thing I just wanted to show you in that area, but just to explain to you why we need emulsifiers, why it is not possible to make stable systems without using an emulsifier. This is emulsifier part 2, and this thing behaves a bit like flailing arms. And this fellow's got no charge on him, but again, he's got the same thing. Again, he's like a tadpole. Again, he's got an oily bit which just loves oil, and it's got a bit here that loves water. And if you imagine that when you put these things together and you try and get two droplets to come together, well, they have to overcome all of this activity, all of this beating of these rods, these arms, and they stop the two droplets from meeting. So effectively, they put a barrier up and they ensure that that not happen. So anyway, as I say, that is the end of the physics lecture. So let's talk about common sense. Now, I never cease to be astonished at the number of people, and they get a cream when they go into their favorite department store. They rub it all over their hands like that. Isn't it great the way this rubs in? Well, I have news for you folks. There's no such thing as rub in. Because when you take a cream, and here is our cream, and it's got all of our emulsifier around it, and it's got all of this lovely oil in the interior, and you put it onto your skin, what do you get? You get evaporation. And all the water goes off up into the air. And if you rub your skin sometime later on, you say, oh, it's all rubbed in. Well, no, it hasn't all rubbed in. All that's happened is you spent an awful lot of money on water, and all that water has evaporated off into the atmosphere. And I'm quite certain you've made the shareholders of the company who sold you the product very, very happy indeed, because you spent an awful lot of money on water. So anyway, the point is that, yes, there are certain things which, can be contained in the aqueous phase that might have an effect on the skin, but effectively it's the combination of the oils and the waxes and the fats which trap moisture. How do they trap moisture? Well, you get a constant movement of water from underneath the skin, and the oil acts as a barrier. It traps those in that area, and this of course causes the skin to become hydrated. So The first thing to say is that there is no such thing as rub-in. It just does not happen. And if it does rub in, it just means there's no oil in your product. Now, sometimes that can be a good thing because sometimes we get pharmaceuticals and they contain a drug active. And, you know, it is only by distributing the drug active around the skin in low concentration and by not having too much wax or oil around the place, which allows it to do its job, then that can be a very good thing indeed. But somehow you get the feeling that, well, this serves the cosmetic business very, very well indeed. Now, let's not be po-faced about this, folks. If you want to be part of the cosmetic business and you can sell water and get people to buy it, I say good luck to you. I can assure you, I will not be judging you. So anyway, we get evaporation and the remnant fatty phase remains on the skin. So that effectively you could say that the cream is just an elegant way of delivering small amounts of fats onto the surface of the skin, and then the water evaporates off and we're left behind with the little emulsifier and we're left behind with all of this fat. Okay, how do we make these things? Well, I think it's about time we did a bit of rock and roll. Now, I have a few things here that I made this morning. I want to show you how I made them. Now, I was planning to do a whole Delia business, you know, where I would start heating stuff. And I thought, dear God Almighty, we're going to have steam everywhere and you won't be able to make me out. And, you know, fire alarms are going to go off and all sorts of dreadful things are going to happen. Now, you can't see anything at the moment, I don't think. But I will try and drop down my camera a little bit just to give you an indication of what I made and give you an indication of what things look like. This is a typical fat phase. I don't know how closely you can see that. That yellow stuff is actually lanolin. An awful lot of people do not like lanolin. Yes, it does come from a sheep. I think it's wonderful stuff. And I have a lot of emulsifier phase down here at the bottom. And this is my oil phase. So I have it in a glass beaker. You could just as easily do this in, I don't know, a metal container. The only problem with the metal container is we're going to be heating this to about 70 degrees. And if you're going to be heating it to 70 degrees, it's so much easier if you can hold this at the top because you can heat that away to 70 degrees and it won't burn your fingers or it won't scald you. This is the aqueous phase. All I have in this is water and glycerine and a few various extracts like that. And then I have a thing called tromethamine. And tromethamine is a base. I'll be talking about it a little bit later on. And when we talk about some products, because I have some formulations to show you at the very end of the presentation. By the way, Niall, if you're out there and I'm going on too long and I'm banging on too long, you just tell me to shut up and I'll stop and I'll move off. Anyway, by heating these two separately to 70 degrees, how do we do it? We just get ourselves a hot plate. Where do we get a hot plate from? We go down to Aldi or Lidl. It doesn't really matter. You can use the hot plate in your kitchen very, very gently. This goes on first because he comes to temperature much more slowly than this guy. If you put these two on at the same time, this fellow will start to burn. He'll start to smoke. And your kitchen will end up smelling like a fish and chip shop or wherever it is you're making it up. So you heat them at 70 degrees. How do we know what 70 degrees is? This is 70 degrees. When you put your hand and it's just that little bit too hot, you can, if you want, use a 70 degree thermometer. You're perfectly entitled to do that. But in the business, that's how we do it. Now, this is what I ended up with. Having done that, I ended up with a product that looks a bit like that. So here's our cream. Now, how did I make it up? Well, I use this thing here. We typically use these things, palette knives. This is very nice because it's very flexible. And sometimes it can be useful to work a product on a glass plate or a slide or whatever it happens to be. Now, it's also useful for another thing, and that is that when you make the product, actually, it's a little bit stiffer than I thought. When you make the product up, it's always a good idea to try and see how it falls away from the blade. Now, you possibly can't see that. See where it's sort of slipping off the blade? I don't know whether you can see that. That is a very bad sign. That is a sign this product is going to be unstable because we expect the product to hold on like grim death. If it doesn't hang on like grim death, it means that it's probably unstable because the blade of the palette knife is wetting with water and then the waxes are running away from it. So typically the first thing that we do when we formulate a new emulsion is we do the simple palette knife test. And if it fails the palette knife test, then it's only a question of we're going through, you know, it is semantics to put it on at 40 degrees because we know full well the thing is going to be unstable. Now, what I advise my students to do is to go and get themselves one of these things. I don't know whether you recognize these. These are beloved of farmhouses up and down the country. And it's just an old butter knife, but it has a nice blade on it. And it's nice for, you know, tipping the amount of product you want and for scraping away off the insides of surfaces and so on. And this is quite flexible as well. So apart from the fact that it's a dreadful looking handle and, you know, let's not let's not be too pretty. Okay, anyway, so much for the demo. Let us go back to where we were. How do we make it? Now, I don't know if any of you have made a mayonnaise or even bechamel or roux or any of these sort of sauces. It's very important that you beat them and you put energy into the system. Why do you put energy into the system? To break up tiny particles. They may be tiny particles of flour to make sure you get no lumps. It may be that when you're making the mayonnaise, what you're doing is you're breaking up the droplets of oil. So it makes sure that you get this lovely, smooth, creamy emulsion. But one way or the other, you put energy into it. In your case, when you're making the sauces, it's usually elbow grease. Here, what we do is we use the energy of heat, because we can't exactly, if we're making a batch and we're making, for the sake of argument, 50 kilos or 100 kilos or a ton, well, you're wasting your time there now using elbow grease. So therefore, we need to do something a bit more distant, for want of a better term. What do? We heat our oil phase and our aqueous phase separately. So in other words, this one I showed you here, which is the aqueous phase, and that gets heated first of all. And when it's just about coming to temperature, we drop on our fat phase, and then we heat that to 70 degrees. I usually put the water phase into the oil. Most people do, because what it does is that it inverts the system and you get a very, very fine droplet. You have to start using your palette knife. Oh, I left out an important thing, which is that when you put the two phases together, you must chill this. You must go into cold water. So you get yourself a large beaker of cold water after you combine the two things, and you start mixing and stirring, but you make sure you move it in the cold water to make sure it chills quickly. Why? Well, to make sure that we get the droplets frozen as quickly as possible, and we get them small as quickly as possible, and do not give them an opportunity to remarriage. So we have the phases blended together, either with or without shear homogenization. I'll talk about the homogenization in just a moment, because what I'm trying to get you to think of here is I want you to think a cottage industry. When you're making, in other words, try and pare back your costs as much as you can. I assume most of you do not have deep pockets. In order to get yourselves to the first step, which is to have a good product that you really like, to try and spend no money or very little money in doing so, and therefore you can move on to the next step. So I just made that up by using my palette knife. If it were an issue that I wasn't happy with that, I would just get myself a blender, literally like a hand blender that you used to make soup. It's perfectly acceptable. The only problem with it is that it tends to put air into your system, which is okay, as long as you let the air run out. Okay, sorry, am I going the wrong way here? I am going the wrong way, my apologies. Okay, I hope you're all hearing me now that I'm not speaking out into the great vacuum, but I will continue. So we cool the mixture down to about 40 degrees, and at that stage, we tend to put in the other ingredients. Now, I've put in drug actives here because, of course, we're not allowed to put drug actives in our cosmetic product. But if we were making a sunscreen, for the sake of argument, or anything like that, which had any sort of marginal activity, for example, a fake tan type product, dihydroxyacetone, we would be putting in these things at 40 degrees because they get cooked at 70 degrees. They degrade, they decompose. And especially with perfume, you'd be mad to heat your perfume to 70 degrees. All you're going to do is either destroy it or evaporate it, in which case you'll get a product which doesn't smell particularly of anything. Likewise with colors and preservatives, these sort of ingredients we put in at 40 degrees. Now, here's a little test which I usually set my students. Here we have two soap bubbles. Just like you have kids at parties, and they get this ring and they blow out the bubbles, the soap. And we have a glass tube between them, and we have a tap, and the tap is closed. So effectively, one bubble can't see, in inverted commas, or feel the impact of the other. And we open the tap. Now, of course, because of the fact that I'm not eyeballing you, I can't actually do my, my teacher routine and, fixing you with my BDI or any of that sort of stuff. So I can't actually see your responses. Clearly, there are three different possibilities. First one is nothing happens. The second one is that the big one gets smaller and the small one gets bigger and they end up the same size. And the third one is that the smaller one disappears into the big one. Well, I have bad news for you folks. It's actually the last of these options, that the small one disappears into the big one. And this is a general feature of any so-called dispersed system. So in other words, if you get, particles in a paint tin, they're all going to agglomerate. They're all going to stick to their next door neighbors. If you have an oil droplet which is small and which is attached to a larger oil droplet, well, guess what? The smaller one is going to combine with the bigger one. And therefore, over a period of time, you're going to end up very quickly with an oil slick. And this is just, I'm not going to bore you with the physics behind it, but this is the reason. So the result effectively is that the big one gets bigger and the small one gets smaller. What is the lesson of this for us? We want to try, when we're making our emulsions, to see the droplets are all the same size. So we're stopping that force of nature, which is putting these droplets together. If we can make them all the same size, we know we've got something good. We know we have a very good product. Ideally, these droplets should be very small, and ideally, as I say, they should be around the same size. How are we doing for time? I think we're okay. Right. Somebody's going to scream at me, Niall. If I'm running out of time, you tell me quickly. Okay.
No problem, Brian, will do.
Are we okay? Thanks, Niall. Okay. What about equipment basics? Now, when I'm talking basics here, folks, I'm talking about just, I do this thing on a wing and a prayer because I want you to do the same thing. I do not want you to go out and spend all of your money on developing a product and then realizing you got to spend 30,000 on publicity and marketing, and influencers and all of that sort of stuff, which is associated with product now. You want to hold back your money and you want to try and make it as cheaply as you can. I don't mean to disabuse you of any sort of notions, but assuming you get past the first hurdle and you have a product and you really believe in it, but more importantly, your faith is not sufficient. It has to be a product which is good and which is appreciated and which you think as a USP, a unique selling point. There's a gap in the market for it, and you think this is the right thing, and you're taking it to the next step. What do you require in terms of simple things? We've already said you need ideally a tiled surface and maybe, like kitchen units type things, where you can do your mixing and your weighing and various stuff like that. Ideally, you want a floor balance. If you're going to be making quantities of the order of, 25 kilos or 100 kilos or whatever, depending on how successful things turn out to be, you're certainly going to need a floor balance. You're going to need a smaller bench balance for smaller quantities. Now, Lidl and Aldi have completely revolutionized this thing because you can now buy these things. Now, they're not great, let it be said, and usually for very small quantities, they won't cut the mustard. But they certainly have brought down prices of balances in general. And, sometimes you can get these things, secondhand and so on. And if you can, by all means, do so. But certainly you will require a decent balance. You may or may not require the floor balance. It just depends on the size of your product. If you're making a serum and you're selling it in small quantities, you may just get by with using a small balance. Much of this stuff is banal. Glass and plastic jugs. You're going to be transferring liquids from one place to another. And, if you had a factory, you would have a pump here and you would have a hose going into it and it'd be automatically transferring and you would transfer exactly 250 liters and all the rest of it. But the reality is when it comes to making product and sampling product, you're going to use things like ladles to stick a ladle into the product and drag it out and see if there are any lumps in it. Ideally, you should get a palette knife so you can scrape any powders that might be stuck to the inside of your vessel. If you're making emulsions, you will need a hot plate, but almost always you should get one anyway, because usually there are things which on a cold winter's morning are not going to dissolve for you. And you put a wee touch of heat into it, it makes all the difference. You will also require deionized water. Again, it depends on your application, but I say not softened, because softened water just effectively contains salt. And its function is to precipitate out calcium and magnesium. But we're not talking about that here. We are talking about something which is free of ions. So you're going to need some sort of a cartridge type arrangement whereby you will purify your water. Now, what about mixing? How are you going to mix? Well, you saw how I mixed. I just mixed using a palette knife. You need something a little bit more sophisticated. It may be very sophisticated, may be very straightforward. This is something we use in the lab, and it's just effectively a variation of a hand blender. And this thing spins very quickly. And if you'll notice, you just might be able to see at the bottom, there's a gap there, which sucks up product from the bottom of our vessel, and it fires it out through this screen. So there's an impeller in the interior of this thing, and it just fires the product out through that, and it breaks it up, and it exposes it to high shear. So therefore, you tend to get particles all around the same size. You get a very, very fine emulsion. And usually what happens is these things get built into mixing vessels. So you would get one not at the top of the mixing vessel, but this homogenizer head gets built into the bottom of the mixing vessel. So you don't draw air in, because when you put this guy into a mixing vessel, what tends to happen is you get a V shape. In other words, he'll pull the product in and he'll pull in air as well, and it will aerate the product. Now, as I say, there is no need to spend money on this if you get a half decent hand blender. And you should be able to, get the sort of shear that we're talking about. If, unless, you're particularly unlucky. Okay, now this is the other extreme. And this is where you get to the stage where, down the road, and I say down the road, you may find yourself in this position where you're buying something like this, and usually we try and get them secondhand. You can see the mixing vessel here is still the same, but there's a jacket on it. And the jacket can pass either superheated water, or it can pass steam in order to melt our various ingredients. And then after we've mixed it up, then we put chilled water through exactly the same jacket. So that means that we get both conditions absolutely perfectly. And the stirring inside it typically works like a gate. So you have this gate stir, which tends to move around, and it scrapes the material off the interior. If you ever see something like a Kenwood chef or these sort of things, and you set them up, and what happens is that they tend to have gate stirrers, but they work by turning in two different senses, that the whole thing rotates, but also the gate itself rotates in such a way as to scrape the product off the sides of the vessel. And this does something very similar. But this is the other extreme, and you won't be looking at anything like that unless you're into the pestle and mortar type thing. A few further comments about naturals versus synthetics, and that is that naturals based on petroleum have, now this is a most miserable diagram, folks, and I do apologize, but I stole it earlier on from one of the previous slides, and I was showing you we have these tadpole-shaped molecules, and these are emulsifiers. And the thing is that when you put this emulsifier into an oil droplet, it takes up very little space, because it's only a single hydrocarbon chain, and this could be something like octane, like you might get in, petrol station or whatever it happens to be. Whereas when you get into naturals, they are triglyceride. And triglycerides tend to have 3 chains. And it means then that when you try and pack these things into an oil droplet, there are issues of crowding. And it makes the formulation of naturals that bit more tricky. In addition to that, the emulsifiers that you use tend to match like with like, so that you tend to use emulsifiers which are based on the same sort of triglycerides. So you will get, for example, olive oil derivatized emulsifiers, and you'll get sunflower oil ones, and you get various other ones as well. I'll talk about those in just a moment. Okay, so the commonly used natural materials, well, where do we get our things from? Hyaluronic acid, or hyaluronate as we would usually call it, is produced from a fermentation process. Hyaluronate started out from shark fins, which I'm delighted to say we don't use anymore. And then it went to coxcombs. It came out of coxcombs, believe it or not. And now we just produce it from a biofermentation process. Likewise, xanthan gum. Xanthan gum, of course, is much used in food processing and various other things like that. The difficulty with xanthan is that it tends to form a sort of a cloudy, yellowish type gel or serum. And yellow is a color which, the industry doesn't really like. And typically you must either hide it by putting it into a frosted bottle or put it into an opaque bottle or something along those lines. Where else do we get our stuff from? Well, sustainably sourced vegetable oils and fats and waxes. There's a big kerfuffle, of course, about palm oil. And if you want to source, for example, soap noodle, if you wanted to make soaps, you can now get them. And, traditionally they were slaughterhouse products. They came from beef rendering and so on, fat rendering from beef, and indeed fish. But now we tend to get them from vegetable sources, and now you can get them from sustainably sourced palm oil. So, this would be a major source of our raw materials. Where do we get our emulsifiers from? We get them from derivatization. This goes back to something I said to you at the very start of this presentation, which is that, let's not be all cuddly and warm about doing natural things, because these materials go into a factory. And when they go into a factory, they get modified by using harsh chemical ingredients. So you may start out with something which has come from olive oil, and you end up with something which has been derived from olive oil. But, you know, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that you're going to start eating it, because this has been modified chemically, and we now have emulsifiers which will work very well in the sort of natural ingredients that we're thinking about using. And they will be sold as such, and, you know, they will come from a sustainable source, you know, but as I say, let's not fool ourselves into thinking we're not working with viable chemical ingredients, which is effectively what we are. Okay.
Sorry, Brian, I might just flag there that we'll give a couple more minutes and then we might start the question and answer session.
That's fine, Niall. I'm just coming to an end now. We only have about maybe
perfect,
one or two more classes, or sorry, more slides. So I knew I would wrap it on, and, you know, I probably have any amount of slides, and I'll try and get through as quickly as I can. Some of the thickeners that we can use, okay, we can use, for example, xanthan gum I've already referred to, is a thing called guar gum, and guar is very commonly used as a hair conditioner, because it tends to be positively charged and damaged hair tends to be negatively charged, and the two tend to latch onto one another. We can also get locust bean gum, but these tend to be more expensive. But it's very difficult, particularly when you're making gels and when you're making serums, to get the sort of sparkling quality that you would get in hair gels and various other products like that. Okay, let's talk about problems in manufacture. First thing to say is that when you make a product like I just made it in a beaker there, it will have a certain thickness, a certain viscosity. I don't know how, but when you start to make it in a factory, you will always get a product which is thinner than the one that you are expecting. So you always have to allow that when you're taking your product and you're making a batch of it, and you're expecting to impress all your pals by look at this lovely rich cream, and then suddenly it starts running through your fingers, and you don't know, what happens to it. Well, the answer is nothing happened to it. This just happens. We don't know why, but it does. The next thing is that always, when I worked in a previous manufacturer, we would always use the 110% rule, especially when you're heating something, which is to say that when you're heating the water, there's going to be losses. And typically we would make a batch based on 110%. There's going to be losses when it comes to filling and all that sort of stuff. And there's going to be losses due to evaporation. So we would always make 110% of the required quantities. Okay, very briefly, sources of information. Now, publications. This is all going to be given to you, I understand, later on anyway. This Cosmetics and Toiletries is a very, very good publication, and it is free. So by all means, register for it, and you will get, you get an update pretty much every day, but also you get the journal sent on to you, over the internet and so on. Soap, perfumery and cosmetics used to be a first cousin of this guy, but now you have to pay for soap, perfumery and cosmetics. And I don't really know much about it there. That is the diagram which is present, which you can see there. And you can see some of the headings which are in this month's issue. Happy covers both cosmetics and it covers household, because often you get a sort of an interconnection or an overlap between the two. And this again is free. There's an organization called the Society of Cosmetic Scientists who are based in the UK, and they also cover Ireland. In fact, the president of it at the moment is an Irish woman. They will give a lot of, they organize meetings and various things like that. Of course, Brexit has played hell with everything. So, the problem is that when it comes to getting supplies and so on, it used to be so much easier than now is. Beauty packaging, if you're stuck for ideas about packaging, and if you're stuck for finding suitable suppliers of packaging, this is a very good source. Again, this fellow is free. The suppliers, Zealous used to be known as Stanley Black, S. Black back in the old days, and it was a small company. It was very easy to get information. It was very easy to get samples. It was very easy to get formulations. They are now part of the Merck worldwide organization. It became a Zealous, and it's not as easy to get as much information as you can. Charles Tennant are based in Ireland. They're very good for large volume material. So if you wanted to buy a barrel for the sake of argument of sunflower oil, they'd be absolutely fantastic. Smaller quantities, I'm not absolutely certain. I wouldn't think that they would be as good. There's another company called Chesham Chemicals. They're in the space as well. And this particular one, Evonic, which are I think they're a German company. They're a German company. Very good on natural raw materials, very good on extracts and all of the rest of it. Now, I was just going to finish, I'll just finish on this one here and give you an example of, this is a natural product, which I've made myself in the past. I want you to notice we've got 4 different phases. Now, unlike previously, where I just mixed 2 phases together, heated to 70, and in this case, you do indeed heat that to 70 and this to 70. You combine these and you chill them to 40 degrees, and then you put in this, which is the preservative phase. But in addition to that, you add all of these other ingredients, which you can only add at 40 degrees. So what we actually have here is we have a product which is a little bit more complex in that these guys here, a lot of them will not tolerate 70 degrees, whereas jojoba, argan oil, and this is an example of one of the olive oil derived emulsifiers I was talking to you about before. And it's used with very commonly available emulsifiers. Glycerol monostearate has been used for centuries, well, certainly decades, probably centuries, I would say. Cetosterol alcohol is another. So this is an emulsifier, this is an emulsifier, and this is a co-emulsifier, which helps the emulsifier to work well. I have some other examples further on, but I think for the moment I'll just leave it at that. I was going to show you a commercial product and, you know, all the various ingredients and what they're used for, but I think time is probably again me, and we can maybe talk about that, you know, depending on what your questions are, etc. But I'll probably leave it at that. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you. That's
great, Brian. Thanks very much. You covered quite a lot there, and it's very interesting stuff. Just a very quick question there from your last slide. Is there a source of information where we can, you know, go to determine what is tolerable at each temperature, either 40 degrees or 70 degrees? Like, because you had some there that it mightn't be as clear that you could put naturals at to heat to 70 versus 40 degrees, or is that something that's
usually the way to do that is if you look at the formulation information given in things like cosmetics and toiletries, that they will indicate what sort of temperatures that you can use in your particular oil phase. It is very difficult to get exact information about an individual ingredient, and the best way to do that is simply to try it out. You know, it'll often say that on the safety data sheet, the SDS, it'll probably say when it comes to safety and flammability, it'll probably say, you know, that the product starts to smoke after such and such a temperature. And, you know, you just have to infer that it probably isn't a good idea to heat it to as much as 70 degrees. But also you can tend to get bad smells. You can tend to get a smell of oxidation or degradation or, you know, that sort of thing. So it's very much trial and error. You ask for some samples to be sent to you and you try them out.
Very good. So what we might do is we have a couple of questions in the chat forum. So we'll start with those and then we can open to the floor. So okay. The first question we have is that Ivana was wondering if the deck of slides can be shared. I'm not sure if that's possible afterwards.
If the which can be shared?
If your slides from today's presentation can be shared.
Yes, that's no problem. That's absolutely no problem, yeah.
So then we have a question from Adrienne, who's wondering, is the definition of natural regulated in Europe? And does this definition apply globally, in particular in the US?
Now, I'm not certain about the situation in the US, but my suspicion is that when I first spoke about that organization, the NPA, I think it was, that is actually an American organization. So therefore, effectively, it is worldwide when it comes to the 5% rule, and certainly for sale in the European Union, they will tolerate 5% of non-naturals. You know, I mean, I'm just putting that out there as being something which will allow you a certain flexibility, that if you find, for the sake of argument, that the product is not preserving the way you would like, and even though you hate to put in things which are not, strictly speaking, natural, there's a little flexibility there. I mean, ideally, what we're looking for, obviously, is we're looking to try and get these things 100% if we possibly can, but it's very, very difficult to do that and to get them to tick all the boxes.
Very good, thanks very much. So the next question is from Joanna, and it's how do you test new ingredients for toxicology or irritation? Your product's USP, a new ingredient. So I guess it's in relation to new ingredients. How do you test them for toxicology or irritation?
Oh, now there is.
You did mention irritation at the start. Is that related?
I mean, what you would do with something like that is, you know, I would certainly test it out on myself first of all to try and find out what sort of percentage you know, what sort of safe percentages can be determined. It is something you cannot do yourself. You are going to have to deal with the tox house. Now, the way in which they actually do that is the LD50s and the testing on animals has been more or less gone anyway now for a long time. And that there are various tests which are used whereby, tests are carried out on, I'm just trying to think, egg yolk and various other things like that. There's a lot of different tests which are carried out, and I can't really advise on that. I'm not a toxicologist, but there are houses available where you contact them and you say, look, I have this new extract and I don't know what its, I don't know what its toxicity is going to be. I have to say I'd be very slow about getting involved in something like that because the money is horrendous, and if there are any accidents or any incidents, then you'd want to have a very significant, insurance policy to protect yourself, indemnity insurance. So unless it is something which is really out there, if it's an extract of a plant or, bark or whatever it happens to be, you will tend to find that in some of the pharmacognosy texts, from pharmacy where they've already been extracted, that you've pretty much covered every available extract, unless it happens to be something really remarkable. I'd be very surprised if it hasn't been done before. Okay,
thanks, Brian. So next question is from Sarah, and it's, any tips on avoiding shea butter becoming lumpy once the product is cooled?
You just keep it moving. That's what you do. So
okay.
In other words, what will tend to happen is, when it gets chilled, what tends to happen is that, the oil phase will tend to freeze, or it'll cool down, and it won't tend to start mixing with other oil droplets. In other words, it'll remain dispersed. But as the product itself cools down, you can get cooling on the surface and you can get bits forming. And usually when you would make a batch in the old days in a factory, we would have the thing turned off and we would have the cold water passing through it. And we could have it stirring for half an hour, 2 hours, it doesn't matter, to make sure that the thing is completely homogeneous. And at the end of that, then we take a sample at the top of the batch, sample at the bottom of the batch, and a sample at the middle of the batch. And we would take them away to the lab and we'd examine them to see was there any differences between them. And, usually as long as the thing is kept in motion, there isn't a problem. And it might be just a question of, even if the product happens to set overnight or something along those lines, and it needs to be worked again to try and get it, to disperse properly, that is something you just have to do, whether manually or by using some sort of a mixer of some description.
Okay, very good, thank you. Next we have a question from Ariana, and it's, how does distilled water compare to deionized water? So in terms of your composition and your formulation?
It's just more expensive, but it's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine. Distilled water is absolutely fine. There is no problem. It's just that if you want to make 20 litres of distilled water, it's an expensive process, or even 50 litres or whatever it happens to be. If you can get your hands on distilled water, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's perfect.
Very good. And then also from Ariana is, she was wondering if you could mention a bit about the ingredient EDTA, disodium EDTA.
Yes.
Do you have any
Yes, I
tips
have.
on that?
Yes, that is important, particularly where it comes to, it mops up magnesium ion and it mops up calcium ion. And, strictly speaking, there shouldn't be either if you're using good quality water. But certainly, I was involved in a project many years ago where dye was precipitating out of a perfume, and it was causing all measure of problems. And it transpired that the tiny amount of water being used in the cologne was tap water, effectively tap water, and it was interacting with the dye in such a way as to replace the sodium with the calcium, and that made the dye itself insoluble. So it began to precipitate out, and there were all these awful yellow crystals forming on the interior of the bottle. So the long and the short of it is, EDTA tends to prevent that from happening because it'll mop up any calcium ion and any magnesium ion. It's always a very good thing to include it. Likewise, I would always include some antioxidant. Antioxidants, vitamin E is wonderful stuff. I think it should be in pretty much everything, because this will ensure that you not get any free radical degradation, and especially when you're using naturals, that they can be delicate and you want to protect them from oxygen. And if oxygen gets at them, you get this rancid taste and smell that you get, for example, of olive oil when it's old, or any vegetable oil, or even butter when it goes rancid, that you will get this oxidation. And when you have that present, it'll be okay. Now, wheat germ oil contains about 7% of vitamin E, so it's a very good replacement. So you don't actually have to include vitamin E as such, but I would still say that vitamin E is worth keeping in for the same reason. Very good. So we've just 2 more questions there in the chat forum. So I'll just jump to the one that's actually linked to EDTA. It's just, the question is, does EDTA alter how the active ingredients are absorbed into the skin at all? I have never heard of it doing so. I would be very, very surprised if it did. I don't have any evidence for, I don't have any evidence against, but pretty much every product since the beginning of time that's got water in it has EDTA in it at some level. It's only a very low level anyway. It's usually around 0.1%. It's a very, very tiny amount. I really can't believe it'll have any effect on it. No, is the short answer. Okay, thanks, Brian. So then, second last question we have here is, would you recommend any business or consultant that can help startups with their submissions to the CPNP and the HPRA? I would say go to the Institutes of Technology, because depending on, and I would say try it yourselves. In other words, go into the website first of all, if you have a formulation, and it is actually very easy to get around. They are very helpful people. They would tend to respond to email fairly quickly. So it is certainly true that when it comes to uploading things like, you know, preservative challenge data and stability data for the HPRA, that's a little bit more problematic. But, you know, I think that's more of a secretarial skill as much as anything else, because certainly when I did it myself, I found these big lumps of empty space on top of the document, and I tried to close them up, and because I'm useless at Word and, you know, PDF files and all that other stuff, I just had to give them big lumps of empty space, and they didn't seem to mind too much. But, you know, it is not, there is no particular difficulty in negotiating these sites. It is made to be user-friendly, or they're made to be user-friendly. And I would say try it out. And then, as I say, try the institutes, because otherwise you're going to be into big money. Yes, you will pay somebody and they will do the thing for you. They'll be charging you thousands for the pleasure, and they will do it in, you know, in jig time. They'll do it in a half an hour. And okay, it'll take you a wee bit longer, but you learn an awful lot more by it. And if your product happens to be successful and there happens to be a second and a third one or whatever, then, you know, it's not going to be worth the money paying it out to these people. Very good. And then just the last question from the chat forum is, have you any advice or input on batch codes for your products? I know virtually nothing about batch codes. I'm afraid. Okay. Very, very little. It's a perfectly, you know, black and white answer. No, I only have product development. So coding, no, short answer. So that's it from the chat box, but I'll just give a quick opportunity for anyone else on the call to ask any other questions that they might have for you. Of course, yeah. Just give it a second there. So if anyone has any questions. Okay. So what I'll say is, I guess use this opportunity to thank Brian. Thank you for your time, Brian, and your insight and expertise in this area. It's been very useful and informative, I'm sure, for everyone. What we'll say is that, you know, as I mentioned at the start of the call, there's going to be many more events like this in the new year, and we'll be keeping you posted. The next event is on February the 3rd, and it's going to be on funding opportunities for Irish SMEs. And we're hoping to receive some feedback from yourselves as well, to help inform the future sessions. So what you feel would be most useful, or what you might like to get more insight into. So in the interest of time, if there's no further questions, I'd just like to thank Brian again, and thank you all for your time today. And we hope to speak to you in due course. So thank you very much.
Thanks a million. Bye.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
You're welcome.
Thank you.